The Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU for short. Whether you love it or you hate it, there is no denying that it is the biggest movie franchise in the world right now, and one of the biggest movie franchises of all time in general. Ever since it began with the release of Iron Man in 2008, many of the movies in the franchise have broken several box office records, with one of the movies becoming the highest grossing movie of all time for a brief period of time. The franchise is split into various phases, and although the first three phases are widely considered to be great, Phase 4 onwards has gotten a more mixed, divided reception. I am aware that this is not an unpopular opinion. I'm aware that this is an opinion that a lot of people have. In fact, I'd say that liking post-Endgame MCU is the real unpopular opinion. However, even though this is a fairly popular opinion, I do want to give my own take on it because I do have some opinions on it that I don't think other people have regarding the MCU's drop in quality after Phase 3. At this point, the MCU no longer feels fresh to me. I feel very burnt out watching these movies, and just the constant onslaught of more and more content, it just makes me feel even more burnt out, and it's gotten to a point where I just no longer feel interested in these movies, and the generally mediocre, subpar quality of these recent movies, that adds to it as well. Like, it's one thing if these were all like great movies, but they're not, they're just whatever movies. And that further affects my motivation to keep watching these movies and still be a fan of this franchise. And that's why I'm making the decision to quit the MCU after the release of Guardians of the Galaxy 3 on May 5th. After Guardians of the Galaxy 3, I will be completely done with the MCU. No more movies, no more Disney Plus shows, nothing like that, because I have gotten very burnt out with these movies. So with that said, allow me to go into detail about why the MCU has been going on a downward spiral since the end of Phase 3, and why I no longer feel interested in it, and I'm going to be quitting it after Guardians of the Galaxy 3. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe as well, as it would be greatly appreciated. With that said, let us dive right in. 2019's Avengers Endgame was the perfect finale for the MCU. It was the culmination of everything that occurred in all of the previous movies that came before it. And honestly, if it ended with this movie, a lot of things would have been better. Because of how Phase 4 is, a lot of people say that the MCU should have ended with this movie. And honestly, yeah, I'm starting to agree with it. The more I think about it, the more I realize how much better it would be if the MCU ended after Endgame. And maybe we could have like Far From Home act as like an epilogue to the MCU, but that's it. The thing is, Phase 4 of the MCU is just very like meh, honestly. Like, there were duds in the first three phases. The first three phases weren't perfect. They did have the occasional not so good movie. Thor: The Dark World, which is from Phase 2, was for a long time my least favorite MCU movie, and I imagine a lot of people would agree with me on that, on it being one of the worst movies in the MCU. However, the good outweighed the bad for the first three phases. For Phase 4 onwards though, it feels like the opposite. For Phase 4, most of the movies are just really like average. I mean, yeah, there are flukes like Spider-Man No Way Home and Black Panther Wakanda Forever and hopefully Guardians of the Galaxy 3. But most of the movies like Black Widow and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness are just, they're fine. Like, there's nothing amazing about them, but they're not awful. They're just really like average. The only notable exception to this is Eternals, which is one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. Eternals is a really f***ing boring movie, and it's also extremely long. In fact, it is the second longest movie in the MCU behind Avengers Endgame, which is f***ing 3 hours long. And that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, because just because a movie is long doesn't mean that it's bad. But here's the thing, this movie is so unbelievably boring. This is one of the most boring movies that I've ever seen in my entire life. It's boring and it's extremely long, which is a really deadly combination. There is no reason for me to ever sit down and watch this movie again. I seem to have this thing with Phase 4 where when I watch these movies, I like them at first, and then the more that I think about them, the less that I like them. Like, this especially happened with both Love and Thunder and Quantumania. I really enjoyed both movies when I first watched them in theaters, and then the more that I thought about them, the less that I liked them. Again, it's not that I think that these are awful movies necessarily, but they're just so aggressively mediocre, and I just don't want to keep watching these really mediocre movies. I don't want to keep wasting money on them and whatever just so I could keep watching just borderline mediocrity. I'm sorry. And another thing as well is just we're getting way too much content, and I mean way too much content. Like, it's not even funny. Beginning with Phase 4, we would be getting TV shows added into the mix that are available to stream on Disney+. And at first I thought, hey, this isn't that bad of an idea. And then I think about it more and I realize now that, like, that's just extra laundry. Like, now I realize it's just no longer movies. You have to watch, you know, the Disney+ shows as well. And that's just like extra laundry that you have to take care of. The good thing is that so far, there's only been one movie where you have to watch one of the Disney Plus shows in order to understand what happens in it. But it doesn't matter because that's just extra content that I have to sit through, extra content that I have to watch. And some of these shows like She-Hulk and Hawkeye, they tie in to the Netflix shows, you know, Daredevil and Luke Cage and whatever. Now, on the one hand, it's good that these are now, like, finally, like, canon to the MCU. For a long time, these shows, they were part of the MCU, however, they were mostly, like, separated. You didn't have to watch any of the MCU movies in order to understand anything that happens in these shows. But the problem is, because these shows are now properly canon to the MCU, that means that's just extra stuff that you have to watch. In order to understand Matt Murdock's appearance in She-Hulk, you have to watch not only the Daredevil show, but you have to watch all of the other Netflix shows as well. Daredevil seasons 1 and 2, you can watch on their own without watching any of the other Netflix shows with no problem. However, Daredevil Season 3 requires you to watch all of the other shows in order to understand it. So you have to sit through a bunch of shows, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing because for the most part these are great shows. Well, except for Iron Fist, that one kind of sucks. But aside from that, you know, like, these are some of the best things to come out of the MCU. But it's way too much stuff to sit through, and honestly, it's not worth, you know, watching all of these. There are 6 of these Netflix shows. They all have 13 seasons when you put them together, and they all have a total of 161 episodes. You have to watch 161 episodes of 6 different shows in order to understand Matt Murdock's appearance in a 6-episode miniseries. That is way too much. I'm sorry. It's not worth watching 161 episodes of 6 different shows just for this. Like, I'm sorry, but it's not worth it. As if that wasn't enough, we have characters from non-MCU Marvel movies officially making their debut in the MCU. The most notable examples of this are the previous versions of Spider-Man, played by Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, appearing in No Way Home, and Deadpool 3, which is officially part of the MCU, and I suppose this makes all the previous 13 X-Men movies part of the MCU as well. And Deadpool 3 will have Ryan Reynolds reprise the role of Deadpool and Hugh Jackman reprise the role of Wolverine. Now, at first, this doesn't seem like a bad thing necessarily, but then you realize that these are even more movies that you have to watch in order to fully understand the MCU storyline. If you ever plan on doing an MCU binge-watching marathon in the future, you now have to include the following: the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy with Tobey Maguire, the Amazing Spider-Man duology with Andrew Garfield, and the X-Men franchise, which consists of 13 f***ing movies. I'm honestly hoping that they don't go any further with this and that they just leave it at only like Spider-Man and the X-Men and that's it. I hope they don't, add stuff like, Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider or Wesley Snipes' Blade, just because it's just way too much stuff. Like, these are great movies, but they don't have to be like all connected together 100%, It's fine for them to exist on their own. I have a particularly embarrassing case with the X-Men. Let me tell you all a funny story. The trailer for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness teased that Professor X from the X-Men movies would be in the movie. At the time, I had never seen any of the X-Men movies, and so I thought that he was going to have an important role in the movie, and that maybe like this would be like the X-Men making their debut in the MCU, and so like, I would have to watch all of the X-Men movies in order to understand what will happen in Multiverse of Madness if the X-Men were to appear, or if like Professor X was the only one that will appear, but he'll have like an important role. I had to buy all 13 movies. I had to spend God knows how much money buying each and every single one of these movies, and I had to buy them all online. I couldn't buy them in the stores or anything like that. It took days for them to arrive, and it costed a lot of money. As if that wasn't enough, I had accidentally bought 2 copies of The New Mutants, the final film in the series, which is just an even bigger waste of money, because not only do I have 2 copies of the same movie, but it's 2 copies of a movie that I think is honestly kind of crap, so that just adds to that just makes things even better. I spent days watching all 13 of these movies, making sure to finish them before Multiverse of Madness came out. I had to sit through Dark Phoenix, which is one of the most boring movies I've ever seen, one of the most nothing movies I've ever seen. I don't remember a single thing that happens in this movie. The other 12 movies in the franchise, I remember what happens in them. This movie, I could not tell you a single thing that happens in it. I genuinely could not. Alright, just think about that. I had to sit through one of the most nothing movies I've ever seen for Multiverse of Madness. I had to sit through this movie for Multiverse of Madness. And what do I get in return? I get Professor X being the only X-Men character that appears in the entire movie. And he has like around 5 minutes of screen time in total, probably less than that, in this 2-hour-long movie. I spent God knows how much money buying these movies. I had to spend so much time watching them as well, and what I get is this. I'm fine with him being the only character, but the fact that it's just a cameo and that's it really soured me. I felt like I had wasted my time. I binge watched these movies for nothing. I had to learn about, Professor X's character and his backstory and all that stuff for nothing. I literally could have watched none of these movies and nothing would have been affected. Or better yet, I could have only watched the first X-Men movie and none of the other 12 movies, and nothing would have been affected. People could get angry at me for this, but I don't even care. It's the movie's fault. They shouldn't have put Professor X into the trailer, because that's false advertising. Because you made me think that he would have an important role in this movie when he doesn't. They shouldn't have put him in the trailer. That's false f***ing advertising right there. It's not my fault, it's the movie's fault. Multiverse of Madness is not an awful movie or anything like that. I find it to be very, fine, just another, whatever, it's okay movie. But this whole X-Men ordeal really soured my opinion on it. And I know it might seem like a trivial thing, but I don't care. That's just how I feel. All I'm going to say is I'm just grateful that we're getting a Deadpool 3. And I know I said that I'm dropping the MCU after Guardians of the Galaxy 3, but there's a slight chance that I might watch Deadpool 3. Because I don't want the time that I spent watching these X-Men movies, I don't want it to go into waste. Alright, I don't want it to go to waste. And also because I don't want the X-Men franchise to end off with a disappointing note. Because the last 2 films in the franchise are really bad movies, and I want this franchise to have another good installment. I hate the fact that we are getting an Avengers 5 and an Avengers 6, because not only will this further ruin the emotional grand finale feel that Avengers Endgame had, but it's also just, you have to watch even more stuff in order to understand what happens in these movies. Let's compare Avengers Endgame to Avengers Secret Wars. Alright, what do you need to watch in order to understand Avengers Endgame. Every movie that came before it, in which there are 21 of them. Yes, that is quite a huge amount of movies, but it's not that many, and it's only just movies, and that's it. There is literally nothing else that you have to watch except for these 21 movies. What do you have to watch in order to understand Avengers Secret Wars? You have to watch every single movie that came before it, in which there are over 30 of them, and there are probably going to be 40 movies by the time Secret Wars comes out. In addition to that, you also have to watch every single one of the Disney Plus shows, in which there already are a lot of them right now. I can't even imagine how many there are going to be by the time Secret Wars comes out. And then in addition to that, you also have to watch the Netflix shows, in which there are 6 of them. And then in addition to that, because of No Way Home, you have to watch the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, the Andrew Garfield movies, and the 2 Venom movies, and probably the rest of the Sony movies as well. It honestly wouldn't surprise me if Morbius unironically becomes like connected to the MCU. And then in addition to that, because of Deadpool 3 and to a lesser extent Professor X's appearance in Multiverse of Madness, you have to watch all 13 X-Men movies. All of that just for one f***ing movie. That is insane, and it's just really hard to sit through each and every single one of them. You just feel so burnt out by the end of it, and you have to wonder if it's really worth it. And then you think about it, and it's like, no, it's not worth it, because there's a very good chance that Secret Wars will be like underwhelming and disappointing as well, and you know for a fact that they're gonna keep going after Secret Wars, so that just makes things even worse. The MCU should have ended after Endgame, not just because of the quality of the post-Endgame stuff, but more importantly because if they ended it at Endgame, this franchise wouldn't become bloated and overloaded and whatever. It would just be natural. 23 movies, that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. I know that I would be sacrificing the good movies that have come out of post-Endgame MCU, but I don't care. It's a sacrifice I have to make. The large amount of content that's been coming out for the MCU, I'd say, is the main reason why I am dropping it after Guardians of the Galaxy 3. It's one thing if they're not as good as they used to be, like whatever, nothing can be good forever, but the huge amount of content that we're getting is a completely different thing, and I just don't have the mental capacity to sit through all of these movies again. Looking at the current state of the MCU, looking at stuff like Eternals, it just makes me think, you know what? Scorsese might have been right. My man might have had a point all along. I just didn't see it back then. None of us did. I'm not the only one that feels, pressure and burnout and whatever when it comes to these movies. The people that work on these movies themselves also suffer with this as well. The VFX artists for these movies have gone through so many strict deadlines and so much crunch to finish these movies that I honestly just feel so bad for them. And I'm honestly surprised as well that this is not like a bigger thing. I've seen a lot of people make memes and stuff regarding the bad CGI in most modern MCU movies, such as that one scene in Black Widow that looks like a Smosh or annoying orange YouTube skit from like 2011. Or how about the floating head of that kid from Thor Love and Thunder? Or MODOK from Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania? Just really bad looking CGI. It's honestly kind of funny in how bad they look, but then it becomes unfunny when you think about all the pressure and stress that the VFX artists have gone through working on these movies. They need time to breathe because this is an example of crunch. They are being rushed to make these movies. I look at the floating head from Thor Love and Thunder and I think it's funny at first, and then I remember all the stuff that the VFX artists had to go through, all the crunch and whatever, all the pressure to finish these movies on a tight deadline, and all of a sudden it just becomes not funny to me anymore. And apparently this has been going on for a long time, like even back when the MCU was good, even during like, phase 1, phase 2, stuff like that, like this was going on, but now it's even worse than it was before. Another problem that the post-Endgame MCU has is that because of the generally mediocre quality of these movies, they have no rewatch value. There is no reason for me to ever sit down and watch any of these movies again for a second time. I watch them one time and that's it, and the chances of me ever sitting down and watching them a second time are slim to none. And that's not a good thing. A good movie is a movie that you want to go back to and you want to watch it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. A bad movie is a movie that you watch one time and you never watch it again because it doesn't give you any reason to sit down and watch it a second time. The first 3 phases had a lot of rewatchable movies in them. Iron Man 1 has rewatch value. Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2 have rewatch value. With the exception of Age of Ultron, which is an okay movie, not bad by any means, but not a movie that I would ever sit down and watch again, all of the Avengers movies have rewatch value. Captain America Civil War has rewatch value. Thor Ragnarok has rewatch value. There are movies in the first 3 phases that I would never sit down and watch a second time, but they are extremely rare. Compare that to post-Endgame MCU. Spider-Man No Way Home is the only post-Endgame MCU movie that I would ever watch a second time. Now, this isn't me saying that No Way Home is the only good post-Endgame MCU movie, because that's not true. I think Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings and Black Panther Wakanda Forever are both good as well. However, No Way Home is the only post-Endgame MCU movie that I'd say has any sort of rewatch value, even if it's not the only good post-Endgame MCU movie, if that makes any sense. I'm really hoping that Guardians of the Galaxy 3 will end up being another exception to this, because I really want Guardians of the Galaxy 3 to be good. I really want to leave this franchise on a high note, so I'm going to be greatly disappointed if it ends up being underwhelming or even bad. But even if this movie ends up being great, a majority of the post-Endgame MCU movies, there's no reason for me to sit down and watch them again. There is no reason to watch Black Widow a second time. There is no reason to watch Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania a second time. There is sure as no reason to sit down and watch Eternals again. Avengers Endgame is a 3-hour-long movie, and it has more rewatch value than any of the movies that I just mentioned. Do what you will with that information. And the Disney Plus shows, although they're not bad, they don't have rewatch value in them either. I don't see myself rewatching Hawkeye anytime soon. Even if I don't think it's a bad show, I just don't see any reason for me to sit down and watch it a second time, okay? For my final reason as to why I'm quitting the MCU, let's talk about a recent event that has just occurred. Now, admittedly, I feel really bad for putting this into the video because this is a really serious situation, and I feel like I'm downplaying it by, talking about the MCU when there's like way more important things to be concerned about with this situation. But at the same time, I feel like I have to talk about this. I can't just ignore it and not bring it up, so yeah, let's talk about it. The Jonathan Majors situation. Now, for those who don't know, Jonathan Majors plays Kang the Conqueror in the MCU. Kang is meant to be the next big bad of the franchise. He's meant to be the next Thanos. He's meant to be the main villain for the multiverse saga for phases 4 to 6. He made his debut in the first season of Loki, and he made his film debut in Ant-Man the Wasp: Quantumania. Now, Jonathan Majors does a good job of playing Kang. A lot of people say that his performance as Kang was one of the only good things about Ant-Man 3, and honestly, I do agree with that. But here's the thing. Very recently, a lot of allegations and whatnot have surfaced. I'm not going to go into any specific details on the allegations because I don't want to risk demonetization, but basically a lot of awful stuff has come out regarding Jonathan Majors, and yeah, things are not looking good for Marvel. Again, I feel really bad because this is not something that I should have to worry about. There are way more important things regarding this situation than the MCU, but I have to be completely honest with how I feel about this. I believe they've not been confirmed yet. There's still like allegations. We don't know if they're true or if they're false. Regardless though, this is another reason I'm dropping the MCU. Again, I feel bad for putting this in, but I have to be completely honest with how I feel. I don't want to lie and whatever. Regardless of if Jonathan Majors ends up being innocent or guilty, I'm still quitting the MCU after Guardians 3. And there is a very good chance that Marvel could simply recast Kang to be played by a different actor, which would honestly be a very good idea if these allegations end up being true. But regardless of what happens, regardless of if they recast Kang, regardless of if Jonathan Majors ends up being innocent or guilty, regardless of any of that, I am dropping the MCU. Again, I cannot state this enough. I feel bad for putting this in because there are way more important things to worry about with this situation than with the MCU, but I have to be honest, and I feel like it would be wrong for me to not include this into the video, so I have to include it. To the people that have been affected by Jonathan Majors, if the allegations are true, I really hope that things turn out better for them. And I feel really bad for the stuff that they went through if it ends up being true. So to wrap things up, I am basically done with the MCU. I'm done with these movies. After Guardians of the Galaxy 3, I am completely done. Maybe I'll watch Deadpool 3, and maybe I'll see what they'll do with Spider-Man next, but aside from that, I am essentially done with these movies. This franchise should have ended after Endgame, for a lot of reasons, not just because it stopped being good after Endgame, but also because it would feel less bloated than it does now if it ended after Endgame. I realize now that adding TV shows into the MCU was a massive mistake, and they shouldn't have done that, even if these shows aren't necessarily bad for the most part. I'm sorry that this is a long video, but I just wanted to get this stuff out of the way because I'm just burnt out with these movies, and I hate seeing how this franchise has turned out, you know. Like, all the great movies from the first 3 phases are likely never going to be repeated for Phase 4 onwards. I mean, yeah, there are going to be exceptions like No Way Home and hopefully Guardians of the Galaxy 3, but that's it, basically. That's it. So anyways, if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.